Hi everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk about why to shoot 24 frames per second. And there's a list of reasons. First, 24 frames per second is just good looking. At least to this filmmaker anyway. And most people seem to like the look of 24 frames per second in my experience. So, there's that. Number two is it's compatible throughout pretty much the entire world. If you're talking about digital cinema, it is supported in this entire planet that we're on. Basically, all the digital cinemas in the world are projecting 24 frames per second because that's what Disney and Warner Brothers and maybe one of these days even me is delivering to the theaters to project. And it's been a standard frame rate for film production for a very long time. A lot of TV also, over the years, has shot at 24 frames per second and used what's called 3:2 pull down to actually convert their 24 frames per second into the 29.97 and 59.94 frames per second sequences that are transmitted over the air, both in the analog television days and even now. In the analog days, the frame rate was always 59.94 fields or full 29.97 frames per second. Now in the digital era, a television station is in the United States allowed to actually transmit at 23.976 or 24 frames per second, for example, if you really wanted to. But no one really does that, from what I can tell. Pretty much everybody is doing 29.97 or 59.94. Why are they doing this? I would argue it's for compatibility. And one of the nice things that you can do if you're using a higher frame rate like 59.94 is soap operas at 59.94 can be displayed. You can have news or something else that's at 29.97 or 30. Then you can have your primetime shows and stuff like that, as well as television movies and feature films that have been licensed for airing, all of that at 24. And when you display 24 frames per second, you can actually do what's called a soft telecine, where you can basically tell in the MPEG-2 data stream of ATSC 1.0, we're getting real technical now, but you can have the encoder say, hey, listen, this is really 24 frames per second, just so you know, but we're gonna have you up convert it basically at the TV set to 29.97, etc. That's my understanding of it. If any broadcast engineers that understand this better than I, because I'm sure there are plenty of those people out there, feel free to leave me some information about it in the comments and your perspective. But that's my understanding. And you can also do what's called a hard telecine, where you actually just do your actual 3:2 pull down in the video feed itself directly. But regardless, you can actually use 24 frames per second in basically the entire world, because using different pull down schemes, you can show it on NTSC, you can show it on ATSC 1.0, 3.0, you can show it on PAL if you're in the analog days over in Europe or something, and CCAM, but you can also show it in all the digital standards as well around the world. And so, for example, I could upconvert 24 frames per second into 25 using a pull-down process. Basically, you speed it up a tiny bit, and then you pitch shift the audio, if I remember it, to get it to 25. I think that's all you have to do. Don't quote me on that one. But the point of the matter is that 24 frames per second is very compatible. If you shot 30 or 59.94 frames per second, down converting it looks bad. And in my experience, looking at 24 up converted does not look nearly as bad. Of course, in a perfect world, we'd be displaying 24 frames per second completely natively at all times, but unfortunately, that's not necessarily a reality for a variety of reasons. So 24 frames per second, in a nutshell, is very, very compatible. And so that's another reason that you could use it. Again, the look we've already talked about, but I think another one to consider, and I've seen other people talk about this, is like the perception. Stuff shot at 24 frames per second just feels more high quality, I think, to a lot of people, even if the exact same thing was at 30 or 60. Personally, I have felt this way about content since I can remember. Even when I was a kid, I didn't really know it, but I was self-selecting for the 24 frames per second content heavily. And so I guess that said, even little Vincent's brain, when he was a child years ago, was actually self-selecting for what he defined as high quality, and high quality was 24 frames per second, I suppose. Or maybe it was just pure random luck. Who knows? I know these days that a lot of the stuff I like is at 24. There is stuff I've watched over the years at other frame rates, of course, as most people have, but 24 frames per second, it has that appeal, I think, to people, and it makes you think, this is a big deal. This is a high quality, expensive production because traditionally high quality, expensive productions have shot at 24 frames per second. If you look at, like I said, a lot of primetime television is shot at 24 frames per second. So, you know, you can think of all kinds of different stuff. Shows like Young Sheldon, for example, 24 frames per second shot on Arri Alexa, literally just like we would shoot a feature film, almost to a T, but not a feature film. It's a single cam format. It feels very similar. Again, it's not exactly the same as a feature film. Obviously, it's not, you know, structured that way and all that, but you get what I'm saying. If you look at the way it feels from a visual standpoint, you get that 24 frames per second, you get shot on Arri Alexa, you know, you get this style of lighting and everything you can only do with single cam work that just feels different than if we did that same show at 30. And so I think people have learned to associate 24 frames per second with quality. Now, whether or not that is actually a valid assessment is, again, up in the air. I personally have seen good stuff produced at other frame rates. It is definitely possible, but I like 24. So anyway, in short, in conclusion, do I think that you should shoot 24 frames per second? Maybe. I mean, look, obviously I love 24 frames per second, and this is going to be a decisive topic.
24 frames per second, 24 frames per second, and the viewers are gone.
Because some people do like the look of higher frame rates for whatever the reason. But I do personally like 24 frames per second. And so you're going to be seeing my work at 24 frames per second for the foreseeable future. Again, you'll have to make up your own mind on what you want. If you want something to look like it was shot on video, for example, you would not want to shoot it at 24 frames per second because that, you know, it looks like film. I want my stuff to look like film. So again, for me, that's where it's at, is 24. But regardless, folks, let me know your thoughts in the comments about this, but please be respectful. I know this is a topic that can get a little heated, but I just, you know, just sharing with you some information about the topic that has been rattling around in my head for a little while. Hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching. Goodbye, everybody.
And action.